Hey friends, it's me, Zoe, aka Magic Pixie Dream Girl. Welcome to this episode of the Lightcast, where we're going to take a look at the era of chaos, the lore surrounding it, and theories about what really happened. Let's dive in. At the end of the era of the sky, Zelda chooses to return to the surface to protect the Triforce. By the time the dust settles on the era of chaos, the Triforce is sealed inside of the sacred realm in the Temple of Light. So what happened? According to Hyrule Historia, it's because word of the Golden Power spread and things got pretty dark. I feel that what we know of things before the return to the surface and what we see in the era of prosperity give us small clues to a more complex situation than just being about people finding out about the Triforce. I want to dig into that, so let's focus on the return to the surface. Following the events of Skyward Sword, it wasn't just Zelda that returned to the surface. Most of the groups were resettling the surface as well. Masterworks tells us that the Gerudo chose the desert and settled it as their own country independent of Hyrule. Their purpose for choosing the desert is unknown, but I want to offer speculation about it. Skyward Sword tells us that the Lanayru Desert once had an advanced civilization that collapsed. They left behind robots and mining equipment. The way I see it, they chose the desert because they once occupied the region and knew it was abundant with rare gemstones. Or rumors spread of the abandoned mine sites, and they chose it for that reason. I personally feel that they weren't the highly advanced civilization in the desert that collapsed. I would bet that it was the Zonai, but that's a topic for another time. The fact that the Gerudo formed their own independent nation outside of Hyrule is fascinating. I can't speculate on the relations between the Gerudo and the Hylians because we simply don't know. But I wonder if it created a power vacuum that filled the Hylians with uncertainty. The evidence tells us that there was at least a power struggle amongst the Hylians. The Interloper War is highly theorized to have happened during the era of chaos. I'm not going to speculate too much on the identity of the Interlopers pre-banishment, mostly because a friend of mine has a decent amount of evidence as to who they were, and I don't want to steal their thunder. Suffice to say, they were most likely Hylians. Let's review the events of the Interloper War as a refresher. The Interlopers are said to have attempted to use dark magic to gain dominion over the Triforce. Given that rumors of the great power were spreading throughout the land, I have a hard time believing the Interlopers were the only ones that wanted to be in control of that power. Interloper, by definition, means a person who becomes involved in a situation in which they are not welcome and do not belong. I'm calling this definition out to help clarify the actual lore behind this conflict. Interloper is an invention of Nintendo of America. The Japanese source text simply refers to them as the Dark Tribe. This distinction is crucial, and the use of the word interloper, where it was not intended, muddies the water a bit. It detracts from the cutscene in Twilight Princess that explains the conflict. In this cutscene, we can see Ilia's pupils disappear and then a knife appears in her hand. In Japanese media, the disappearance of pupils to show a solid color is often an indicator that a person has become possessed, or that they are under the influence of someone or something else. Next, Ilia gasps, and then we see her knife fall to the ground before seeing Link's eyes change to appear the same way as Ilia. While Nintendo has shown some pretty dark moments on screen in their games, they often don't show life-ending violence between humans. This is the reason that most bosses in their games are non-human beings. Ilia dropping the knife is a subtle way of illustrating the conflict. It hints that the conflict was so bad that it pitted family members against one another. Once Link transforms, it shows him Kate bushing his way up a hill towards the Triforce. The closer he gets, the more slowly he runs. As he approaches the Triforce, it shows us 3 dark copies of him, and the dialogue tells us that the Dark Tribe, who excelled at magic, attempted to establish dominion over the sacred realm. Ultimately, we see Link turn to dust and scatter before reappearing on the hill with the other copies. The cutscene begins playing a version of the creation theme at an increased tempo, underscoring the sudden, urgent involvement of the divine. It ends with a warning from Lanayru, the light spirit, about the dangers of power and an unsettling view of many copies of Ilia, slowly rotating upside down and laughing like a cursed child's toy. There is an enormous amount of symbolism in this cutscene, especially at the end. While they show Link returning to his senses, it seems that Ilia is not quite the same, but without the appearance of being possessed, and it's crucial to understand when trying to discern the narrative intent. To me, the ending of the cutscene, aside from having a goal of creeping out the player, demonstrates that the people of the conflict were forever changed by it and that no one was the same afterwards. At least that's what I used to believe. Echoes of Wisdom provides us more information about the creation of the world. During that game, we witness multiple instances of Null creating imposters of real people. At the beginning, the imposters are obvious. They have red eyes and appear nearly identical to those they are copies of. By the end of the game, Null has created an imposter of Zelda that doesn't have glowing red eyes. The imposter of Zelda even comments that it was a perfect echo. You can probably see where I'm going with this. It has led me to interpret the ending of the interloper conflict differently. It makes me think that evil got the last laugh, that it has the ability to blend in to the point where it's harder to tell the difference between the people you know and dark copies of them. There's a broader parallel in Twilight Princess that hints that a darker evil was behind the Dark Tribe and their actions, namely in the form of Ganondorf granting power to Zant in order to use them toward his ultimate goal of creating a dark world. If it were any other series, I don't think I would try and draw that conclusion, but this is The Legend of Zelda, where the story is often delivered through subtle narrative and parallel plot devices. We see something like this happen again in the era of prosperity. To talk about this, I'm going to focus on the presence of Koume and Kotake in the Gerudo assault memory and leave out the plot points from Tears of the Kingdom surrounding Zelda's presence. Koume and Kotake, also known as Twin Rova, are Ganondorf's surrogate mothers, and are said to be controlling the tribe from the background. This famously plays out in the era of the Hero of Time when they brainwash Nabooru into fighting Link as an iron knuckle. It stands to reason that most of the Gerudo tribe were under their influence during the era of prosperity. There's also odd behavior we can point to, which would indicate some sort of influence. Tears of the Kingdom Masterworks talks about what happened after he transformed into the Demon King. The Gerudo deposed him as king and chose a new leader. They even made a point to mention how interesting that must have been for them. If you're new to examining lore from this series, I can save you some headache by telling you that subtle hints like this are the way in which the development team is trying to get you to pay attention to something. As a side note, while I love the exposition of lore in companion books, I find it frustrating that you even need a companion book to understand the overall narrative. Based on their track record, I believe they do this with good intentions. But I think it helps to create the narrative that the writing is bad and always has been. Like, don't get me wrong here. For as much as I love the series, I want these little details in the games. Tangent aside, when we look at what's going on when viewed from the lens that a deeper evil was simply manipulating different groups, a narrative emerges of a pathological evil with a single-minded goal. Personally, I believe that this same evil tempted every major villain in the series. If we look at Vati and Ganon alone, one could make the argument that the dark curiosities in them led them to be corrupted completely. To that end, I've begun assembling proof that this is the case. It's one thing to assume that Null was behind most of it. It's more valuable to be able to prove it. The best I can say for now is to stay tuned. I hope to cover that in the coming months. So that's just one hypothesis, but I have another much less magically influenced explanation. Consider the conditions of things at the time of the resettling of the surface. The Sheikah, Gorons, Mogma, Paella, and Zonai were present on the surface at different points while the Hylians were in the sky. The Sheikah specifically were there for thousands of years, watching the seal on demise and waiting for the reincarnation of Hylia. We've got people like Impa, who witnessed the events leading up to the conflict with Demise, who also witnessed the reincarnation of Hylia and Zelda. The Sheikah were Hylians just like the people in the sky, and just as subject to the experience of being human. The potential for defectors is always a risk. At the same time, the Zonai were alternating between living on the surface and the sky for thousands of years. What we know of their culture is one of being highly advanced while also deeply devout in their faith in the gods. That view comes from what we know of Rauru and Minoru. I stand firmly, waiting to die on the hill that their species had darker aspects as well, and the evidence for such an argument does exist. They did, after all, create an entire population of robots for combat and mining purposes. The population was set on autopilot for thousands of years while they attempted to build a utopia in the sky, complete with disposable technology that had an ultra-short lifespan. I'm a firm believer that the lifespan of their technology directly reflects their desire to keep it out of the hands of others. Masterworks talks about this a little bit with regard to the Dragonhead Island construct containers. The reason they were kept there when finished was to keep them out of the hands of other groups. It would be easy enough to assume that they did it for good and altruistic reasons, but I'd rather be fair in examining them in totality. I could do an entire analysis just on the arc of Zonai history, and I plan to, but not for this episode. To summarize, I would invite you to go review the legend of the Stormwind arc with a different view in mind. Ask yourself if the story sounds more like they were saviors, or perhaps just selfishly looking for a way back home in which they used the Rito. Surely these godlike beings could have helped the Rito without making them work for it. The more I read, the more I've become convinced that there was a ruling class in their population that did some not great shit to their own people, and possibly other groups as well. To wrap up talking about the Zonai for now, I'll leave you with a question about them. Were they actually secretive and highly enigmatic? Or perhaps just the recipients of an untold amount of power that they selfishly hoarded, intermingling with other groups only once they were faced with extinction? With these two groups in mind, along with the development of the Gerudo Desert, I would theorize that a War of the Roses scenario could also be on the table for how the era of chaos unfolded. Imagine if your ancestors were on the surface for thousands of years, suffering amongst the demons and monsters. This would have been a brutal existence, most likely. Then, a young woman descends to the surface and proclaims that a divine being should have a lake named after her and that the same deity gave her a sword, assuring that she was the rightful heir of the land and protector of the Triforce. I don't know about you, but I would have firmly been in the camp of telling her that a divine being distributing swords is no basis for making a claim about who should have control over a sacred artifact. Perhaps the early people of the world were more devout in their religious beliefs than I am, going with the interloper conflict as an explanation for the escalating conflicts in the era of chaos. It raises questions for me. Ultimately, they were banished to the Twilight Realm after being chased across the land by the light spirits. In that same era, Rauru seals the Triforce, creates the Temples of Light and Time, and somewhere in there, meets Sonia, both of whom work to cleanse the land. It makes me wonder, did Rauru have a hand in helping to seal the Dark Tribe in the Twilight Realm? Imagine the implications of that if he did, and the people he helped to seal were his own people. While it's interesting to think about, I'd also bring into view that their population was declining pretty severely by that point. Regardless, I'd be hard-pressed to believe that he wasn't involved in sealing them in some capacity. I'm of the opinion that he must have been involved because of the power the Zonai wielded. To what degree he was involved, I'm unsure, but perhaps it has something to do with the Mirror of Twilight. The reason I feel so strongly that he was is because he and Sonia founded the kingdom sometime after that. And I can't see the people of the land simply accepting his authority on the basis of establishing the shrines of exorcism. The era of chaos remains, for me, a giant question mark. It's fun to speculate about the possibilities, and I hope that we get more information about the turbulence of the era someday. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Lightcast. For now, it remains as a way for me to get my random thoughts out about specific aspects of the lore, and to that end, if there's topics you're interested in, please let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, friends.